Well, good day, everybody, and welcome to the Developmental Psychology edition of 5 Minute Psych. In this 5-minute segment, we'll look at brain development, starting with a discussion about the rate of brain weight growth. Then we'll explore each of the 4 phases of brain development before looking at which areas of the brain develop first and last. We'll see that a lot of the action in brain development happens before we're even born. We're born with most of the neurons we'll ever have, and yet our brain only weighs about a quarter of what it will eventually be. By the time we're 6 months old, our brain is already half of its eventual adult weight, and by 5 years, we're 90% of the way there. So if we're born with most of our neurons, what accounts for this rapid increase in brain weight? It's the synaptic connections, as neurons increase their connections with other neurons so that they work in networks. Later in childhood, growth rate slows, and by adolescence, there's a lot of pruning of the unused connections. In this way, the brain can be customized to its specific environment. There are 4 phases of brain development, and as you'll see, the brain grows from the inside out. The first phase is called neurogenesis, or the birth of neurons, starting 6 weeks after conception and lasting until roughly week 18. Neurons are born in a hollow tube called the neural tube, which forms at the back of the embryo and closes by day 28. The top of this tube will be the brain, and the bottom the spinal cord. Once a neuron is born inside the neural tube, it needs to travel to its right destination in the brain, and this next phase is called migration. The new neurons migrate from the center of the tube to the surface of the brain by using radial glial cells, which are fibers that extend outward from the wall of the tube, much like scaffolding, and they grow with the brain so that they always end at the outermost surface of the brain. So, neurons that are born later have to travel a lot farther and push their way through other neurons to reach their final resting place, a process that maybe took a day for the first neurons, but could take as long as 2 weeks for the last neurons. Neuron migration begins almost immediately after the first neurons are born and continues for about 6 weeks after the last neuron is born. After a neuron reaches its final destination, it has to differentiate or take on a specific function. This is partly based on genetics, but it would be bad if our brains were completely pre-wired because this wouldn't allow anything in our brain to change with experience. So another way that neuronal differentiation occurs is by the kind of input that the neuron receives from its connections with other neurons. So if a neuron is connected with a neuron from the visual cortex, then that neuron will end up doing something related to processing vision. Experience also plays a role in cell differentiation. Let's suppose that you have a neuron that was meant to process binocular information from both eyes, but the child was born blind in one eye, and it wasn't corrected until a few years later. In that case, that neuron that was reserved for binocular vision might have assumed a different function, since it wasn't being used for the original function. So basically, a neuron's job is determined by both genetic and environmental factors. After neurons have differentiated, they need to mature by making connections like growing dendrites, axons, and synapses. This last phase of neural development continues well into adulthood, but it begins right after migration. For the neuron, making connections is a matter of survival because only the neurons that make connections survive, and the other ones die. Just like with neurons, many more synaptic connections are formed than are present later in development. The number of synapses declines over the lifespan, and this is due to synaptic death from inadequate connections. In fact, we end up losing almost half of the synaptic connections that we once had. This helps the brain focus on strengthening the good connections and allowing us to adapt better to different environmental demands. At birth, the brainstem and midbrain are the most developed, and this is a good thing because they're important for inborn reflexes and biological functions. The first areas of the cerebrum to mature are the primary sensory and motor areas, allowing the infant to take in the world around them through their senses and interact with it as they gain more motor control. But the last areas of the cortex to develop are the associative areas, right at the front. These regions deal with planning, decision-making, impulse control, and other executive functions, and they don't reach adult levels until our early 20s. Well, we just discussed brain development by starting with a discussion about the rate of brain weight growth. Then we focused on each of the 4 phases of brain development, and we ended by examining which areas of the brain develop first and last. Now, aren't you glad you had 5 minutes?